So here we are, we're up to week 3. We're continuing to ask this question about what is your idea of an ideal America. And I can't tell you the answer. You have to find it in your own heart and soul and believe it passionately, because when you believe it passionately, you will pray for it effectively, you will walk your prayers, you will put feet on your prayers and take action in the world effectively. So this is not me telling you what you should believe or what you should choose. This is helping you discover what are you passionate about so that you can get committed to it. One of my core beliefs, and I am going to fight for this one, is that people on both sides of the aisle love this country. And if we both love this country, why are we so busy beating each other up? Beating each other up gets you the South Pole on the polarity map, the dysfunctional country. So I don't want a dysfunctional country, I want a functional country. And I am willing to carry the flag and sing patriotic songs and fight for us to find a way to a higher level resolution to this. And that's why I'm teaching this class. It's why I'm going to be far more politically engaged than I have been, because one of our challenges, and this is going to be one of Aristotle's questions for us today, is what is citizenship? What is the purpose of a polis, or a government, or a political body, a group of people who have decided to self-govern? And what is our duty and obligation as citizens to participate in that? And so I've taken that challenge very personally. What is my duty and obligation as a citizen to participate? I think that is potentially up for a lot of folks these days. All right, so here's the Maslow expanded hierarchy. I've talked before that there is this hierarchy that was the original one that ended with self-actualization. And if you look in most of the psychology textbooks, that's the one you will see. What we have here, and there's different versions of it on the internet, not authored directly by Maslow, but based on his last book, On the Farther Reaches of Human Nature, he was noticing that there was a stage of development beyond self-actualizing, and he called those people the self-transcenders or the self-actualizing self-transcenders. And what he meant by that is that these were people who were seeing a significant reduction in ego activation and an expansion of a commitment to being of service to the whole. Something was changing. And if you are interested in what he was seeing, you can get this book, On the Farther Reaches of Human Nature, by Maslow. It was published after his death, so it was in draft when he died. It's a little choppy, but even still, I find it a very valuable book. And essentially what I think he is describing is a level of attainment in personal growth and in stages of development that looks a lot like highly emotionally and spiritually intelligent people who have really done their interior spiritual work to subdue their reactive, egoic responses, and to see things from a very big picture, and to really be of use. And so his insights from his research back in the 50s and 60s, whenever this was taking place, is still very relevant. And this is an extrapolation of what he was talking about in the book to add additional levels. So you have the need to know and understand, the need for beauty, and the self-transcending need sort of being added here, which I think is helpful to think about. Now, I asked each of you last week, we began it in class, and I asked you to complete it during the week to think about what you would populate these levels with in terms of describing your ideal America. I believe in doing my own homework, so this is my homework. So at the bottom, we have physiological needs. Well, I would hope for all of us to experience that we have safe and sufficient food, that we would have water. There are actually a lot of conversations going around, is water a right or not? Yeah. So, and is clean water a right? So I think it's helpful to remember this is the bottom of the pyramid, right? And we will drive people very quickly into survival mode if we pull away things from the bottom of the pyramid. So do I have access, and should every American have access to safe and sufficient food, to clean water, to shelter? Doesn't have to be a luxury home, but can everybody at least have shelter of some form? Do we choose to provide that, or do we say toughen up and figure it out yourself? And these are debates in the tough, tender polarity. When do we push back and say tough, figure it out, and when do we say this is a time to be tender and provide? Healthcare access for all, hot button topic. Healthcare is a survival issue for many people. right? And if you suddenly lose access to life-saving medications, what happens, right? I mean, you could die, right? And so people without access to necessary surgery, without access to emergency care, without access to whatever, there are consequences for this that are very much at the bottom of the pyramid, right? So I think there's some significant survival activation happening in the healthcare conversation, right? Then we have safety conversations. My vision, my hope would be that all Americans and all residents here would feel safe wherever they go inside this country, right? Because we're talking about the ideal America. So no matter where you go inside this country, you would feel safe, and that the justice system would feel fair and equal. But that's just how I populated that. Obviously, this is just me. You don't have to agree with any of it, but it might give you ideas. On the third level, belonging and love, that we are all free to love whomever we love, and that we all have groups we feel we can openly share with and be safe with. Now, those become our bubbles and our limitations if all we ever do is talk with other people who think like us, right? So ideally, we'd all be able to move outside our bubbles, but you kind of need a safety zone too. So I would hope for everybody that they would have like Cheers. Remember the TV show Cheers where everybody knows your name? There's like that place you go where everybody knows your name and you feel welcome. So you have kind of your tribe in Spiral Dynamics purple sense. You have that sense of belonging and that sense of tribe. Now, obviously, I'm showing a political bias with we are free to love whomever we love. Right? So that is my way of explaining that level. You may or may not agree with it. But for me, it's a useful clarification. Self-esteem. We can gain self-esteem through healthy challenge and support. This is the tough and tender parenting, right? If you give kids awards for everything, no award means anything, right? That's the criticism that we get of the parenting style that over nurtures and celebrates showing up and breathing. It's like you undermine the value of achievement if you reward everything the same. And yet there's some truth in unconditional love. So in the coaching world, this is actually a polarity that coaches have to help manage. How do you support your client and offer sympathy and understanding to whatever their current dilemmas are without fostering a victim story? You know, like how do you challenge them to get out of whatever their victim story is and to take the next developmental step? So the right balance of challenge and support is not just necessary for children, it's necessary for us as adults as well. So for me, I chose those words carefully. We gain self-esteem through healthy challenge and support. Genuine accomplishments are rewarded, and we are respected just because we exist. So that's a polarity, right? You distinguish people and you show differences, and in some ways you never show differences. Does that make sense? And boundaries are set for bad behavior, but set without bias. So if we agree that killing other people is not okay, except in very limited circumstances like self-defense, then we enforce that equally. To know and understand, this is a beautiful one, and boy, has this been in the news this week. Access to learning for everyone, right? A really important value for a lot of us. What does it mean? What kind of access? Who pays for it? That is a significant conversation to be had. And what is the best way to deliver that to create the best possible citizens? I think there's some legitimate arguments on both sides of the aisle around how to do that. So can we hear both sides of the aisle? Aesthetic needs, the need for beauty, nature, museums, parks, having music, having creative expression of all type, both my ability to express my creativity, but to be present to the creativity of other people. There is something elevating about art and beauty and nature. Do you guys feel that to be true? Yeah. And so if you recognize that, then that becomes part of your ideal America. Like we have an ideal America where we have national parks or city parks or bike trails, or we support scouting so that kids have experiences outside of an urban environment, or whatever. There might be a million ways, museums, art classes, that you find engagement with creating an ideal America at this level. At self-actualizing, next week we're going to talk about equal employment opportunity and affirmative action, just because we haven't had enough controversy in the room yet. So we're going to tackle that one. And this is one of those real American dream questions. Like, you can be all that you can be. There is no barrier to your achievement. Like, we hold that as a sacred ideal here. And yet, it's not always true that people have equal access. So, what does it mean if there are inequalities, and how do you deal with them? Right? So, that requires some complexity of thinking about cause. Is the cause the person? Is the cause a system? I really value meritorious accomplishment. I want everyone to have a shot at it, so I do value equal access to meritorious accomplishment. So how do we make that happen? And merit-based systems to encourage people are important, and they don't always work perfectly. So I think we need to think about that. And Aristotle raises some really interesting challenges about what a society chooses to honor and reward. And sometimes we honor and reward things that, if you think about it from a more dispassionate standpoint, why is a basketball player worth more than a teacher? I don't know. Like, how's that dynamic happen? And it's complex. There's not simple answers to this, and there's not simple fixes to this. And I'm not going to leave you with answers. I'm going to leave you with ways to think about the problems, right? So that you can just keep thinking about it. And then self-transcending. What I would hope is an America that allows for conveyor belts of development. And that's a phrase I stole from Ken Wilber. If any of you read Integral Theory, he talks about we need healthy conveyor belts to get people from the bottom of the spiral to the top of the spiral as fast and as far as they choose to go. So that we're not creating obstructions to development. We have an open flow as far as people choose to go. You don't have to go all the way, but if you choose to go to yellow and beyond on the spiral, we should have the means that allow for that. So I really loved kind of going through this exercise. And I plugged in the spirituality aspect at the self-transcending level because, to me, this also includes the ability to develop our spiritual intelligence and transcend our smaller self or our ego self and move into our highest and best nature, which is also kind of an Aristotle goal, to become fully human. So we'll be talking about that in a moment. Now, on the other side of the page, I have a slimmed down version of that very lengthy process I put myself through. And it reminded me a little bit of Stephen Covey. If you know Stephen Covey, he says, our goals are to live, to love, to learn, to leave a legacy, which is a short form of the Maslow hierarchy. So to live is at the bottom, to feel safe in my own country, to be loved and to give love, to feel competent in the world. And I love that word competent. Right? I think that's really important part of having self-esteem is feeling like I can do it myself. Anybody ever raised children and they go through that phase of, no, I do it myself? There's value to that. It's great. To learn and to grow, to create and to be in the presence of beauty, to achieve and to express my talents. Like, we each have gifts. We want to be able to express them. And to grow up and serve the world. So that's the shorter version. All right, we've got another exercise for you to do now, and it involves using the little blue dots on your table. These are on these little things, and what I'm going to ask you each to do, but let me explain it before you do it, is each person's going to take 2 dots, all right, like that, all right, take 2 dots, and you're going to answer these 2 questions. The first question is, are people basically trustworthy or untrustworthy, or somewhere in the middle, all right? And I have on the back wall taped up a piece of paper where you're going to post your answer. And then the second question right below it is, the world basically dangerous or basically pretty safe and friendly, or somewhere in the middle? That. So we're more on the it's safe and it's trustworthy. Everybody is partially wrong, everybody's partially right, right? And when you have a strong bias in one direction, sometimes the most important voice to listen to is the one on the other side. But the one on the other side is often the one that's shamed and silenced. And this is the risk of bubbles, right? If we bubble ourselves on Facebook, if we bubble ourselves in our social groups so that we only ever reinforce our own opinion, we might actually get surprised by an untrustworthy experience, right? These biases are part of the elephant rider conversation. Remember, we've had this elephant rider conversation every week, and this is part of what Jonathan Haidt has really popularized, the guy who wrote The Righteous Mind that we'll be looking at in April. The rider is our neocortex and our logical mind, and the elephant are the older brain structures, our limbic system, and it also includes our intuition, our sense of maybe communal wisdom, but also all of our prejudices and biases, right? So the elephant runs the show the great majority of the time. And anytime we're scared, the elephant takes over, right? So any of our biases, like we've just revealed a couple of them, will show up most loudly when the elephant is in charge. We can balance and do these nice little polarity maps when our neocortex is in charge. Long-term social evolution, I think, comes from us as individual writers dealing with our own elephants, as well as building enough positive relationships that the elephants start to be influenced by each other. And I mentioned the example of how quickly American ideas shifted on the topic of gay marriage and equal marriage rights, and that quickly being a sociological frame of reference, it didn't feel quick for a lot of the people waiting for those rights. But in terms of human history, relatively quickly, because so many people came out of the closet so quickly, we had these love connections, elephant to elephant, with people. All of a sudden, we realized that we were judging. And those relationships caused us to change our thinking, right? It wasn't all the logic arguments in the world from scientists. It was our relationships with each other, at least that's the dominant theory right now, that caused the sudden tip. Science was helping because there was a lot of science saying, look, a lot of this stuff that we think is binary is not binary. A lot of this stuff that we think is choice is not necessarily choice. And, so there was a neocortex argument going on. But the shift, the psychologists think, really happened because of relationships. So that's really, for me, an important learning as we try and heal the heart of America. How do we work the relationships? And a lot of the working the relationship has to start with me and using my own neocortex to manage my elephant as best I can to say, wait a minute, that's not a truth, that's a prejudice. You have made a decision, you have a bias about this, and you're completely closing out the other side of this pole. So the work is mine to do. Social justice as an interesting topic. What does it mean? And the author, Michael J. Sandel, has threads that he's been weaving through these various chapters, that it includes things like what is called distributive justice. How do you distribute the stuff? Who gets the jobs? Who gets the money? Who gets to inherit the wealth? He distinguishes between income and wealth. Income is what you get from having a job or having a way of making a living or earnings. Wealth is stuff that could be handed off. So your parents might leave you things, and that would be your wealth. And so who gets the wealth? Who gets the income? Who gets the opportunities? There's also an argument around social justice around individual freedoms. Who gets protected? Whose rights are preserved? Whose property is protected? And then Aristotle, he's introducing to put a different kind of conversation into what is a just society, what is an ideal society, which is to say the telos or teleos, I've heard it said both ways, or purpose of a human society has to be considered, that we are more than an economy, we are more than a police force or a military. There is a higher purpose to having a group of people be together. Now, as we think about family, we can sometimes relate a little better to the family dynamic. Is there a purpose to a family beyond food and shelter? Usually love comes up, right? And self-development and letting people have healthy growth, especially the children. So there's something more to the family than just safety and food. If we expand that to our society, is there something more to the society than just safety and food? It's an interesting question to ask, and that's kind of the question that Aristotle is asking. He would say that a purpose of a society is to do all of that stuff, distributive justice and rights and freedoms, but it's also to create good citizens by cultivating good character or by rewarding and honoring virtue. You can say, who decides what's virtuous and how does virtue get enforced, and at what point does it go too far and become its own form of theocracy or out of balance in its own right. But he says there's something to be considered about creating good citizenship and our obligation as good citizens, which he talks about as well. But in a way, he's hinting at what I would describe a little differently in a more Maslow way, that the goal of a society is to help us become fully human. And that brings it into alignment with Maslow and spiral dynamics, if you think about it from that perspective. To live up to our highest potential, it also brings us into alignment with spiritual intelligence if we think about a society is also to provide conveyor belts that allow us to become our highest and best self and maybe transcend our egos. If you look back through history, which the author does a little bit, but that's not the purpose of his book, so I expanded a little bit on what he had in the book. There have been a lot of different governance systems, and they all have had different purposes. Tribal governance, of course, was the earliest system, herds and tribes of Homo sapiens trying to figure things out. The Greeks and Romans had their own flavors of how to do governance and what was citizenship and early attempts at democracy. We had a feudal system that was dominant in Europe and similar systems in other parts of the world where it was a monarchy kind of a situation. Your place in society was determined by your birth. It was not based on merit. It was based on birth. And so there might be a caste system, or there might be a class system, or there might be divine right of kings or queens or whatever was going on, but your place in society was exclusively determined based on your birth. It was not negotiable. It was not changeable. And the only good was the good that the king or the queen declared. Utilitarianism is actually a step forward, even though it's not perfect, in that it starts actually caring about everybody in the group. Like everybody's happiness and everybody's suffering becomes part of the math. Now, utilitarianism, we said, is kind of prone to thinking about life as a math problem. It's a little bit too much in the head, and life isn't that simple. But it is looking for at least counting everybody. So it's kind of radical as a step out in that regard. The difficulty that we run into with utilitarianism is that it is so focused on the collective math that any one individual's rights and needs could be swamped. You in the sum don't count. So you as the child left in the basement to suffer for the happiness of the whole of society, which is one of the examples he used, is to most of us, our elephant viscerally negatively reacts to that. It is too much focus on the collective math and not enough focus on the rights of the child. So just an interesting progress, but still it's too much math. It's also sometimes too much of a we focus, and one of the manifestations, it can sound very utopian, but one of the manifestations that we've seen in our lifetimes was, of course, communism, particularly in the Soviet Union, which led to the counter-reaction of people saying that doesn't work. I mean, and it bogged down in horrible bureaucracy and all kinds of corruption and other problems, but communism and utilitarianism, probably not the answer. And we had Ayn Rand, some of you may be familiar with her, who left the Soviet Union and became a profound argument for libertarian perspectives. Now, I noticed he doesn't mention her in this book, which I found quite interesting. I think her ideas maybe didn't meet the academic threshold for rigor, but doesn't mean they weren't provocative and inspiring, right? Okay, Jesus isn't in there either, right? So people can be provocative and inspiring and not be in the book. But, you know, I found it interesting that when he talked about libertarianism, he was really focusing on the free market of Hayek and Milton Friedman. Some of you may know Milton Friedman, and kind of the free market economics that was advocated by Reagan and Thatcher. So that argument is more of where he went. So libertarian free markets, also only partially true. It has some problems, and we'll get into libertarian problems here in a second. meritocracies, which is the idea that you have a free market, but you make sure you have equality of opportunity, and this, the government might have to step in. So it's like saying fully free, unregulated markets lead to injustice. But if that happens, the government can step in and level the playing field. So let's have a meritocracy with a level playing field. And that was a lot of what the equal employment opportunity stuff was about. Let's level the playing field. And then you have Rawls, who we're going to get to today, who has a different approach for creating the basis for an ideal society. So utilitarianism, just a quick reminder, very we-focused. It's trying to maximize utility, which means pleasure more than pain. It thinks individual rights are part of the math. So if your rights get in the way of the happiness of the whole, you suffer. Okay? So the dominant is to the we. Here we have the libertarian answer to that, which is hell no. My individual rights matter, and it is more important than any of the rest of your math. So the primary purpose of government is to protect individual freedom. And here we see Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman being mentioned. Merit and effort and talent determine who receives what. Now the challenge becomes when talent is not evenly distributed. And it also comes from what talents are we choosing to reward? Are we rewarding how high you can jump relative to a basketball hoop? Or are we rewarding charitable service? Like, what are we rewarding? So there's complexities to all of these that arise. From a libertarian perspective, government only has the right to do three things: enforce contracts between willing parties, to protect private property, and to keep the peace. Otherwise, get out of my life. So if there was a bumper sticker for libertarians, it would be, get out of my life. Leave me alone. Leave me alone, let me be free. And they will argue against most theories of the we, where the we, the needs of the many, might outweigh the needs of the few. So you will find a pushback from them on that. Who's right? Everybody, nobody, right? So here we have the first dynamic that we're seeing between those two. Do we take care of the individual, or do we take care of the collective? And the answer is both. Yes, we take care of both. Right? So finding the and, that's the tricky thing if we're going to get to the ideal America. And what's the right balance between those? So let's get to Aristotle. What is a political association for? What is its purpose, or telos? He says it's for defense, economics, and to form good citizenship, as I mentioned. Now, here are some quotations from the book. If you have your book with you, you might want to open up. We'll read along and mark it up. So I'm at page 195 on this one. He's asking the question, why can't we live perfectly good, virtuous lives without politics, at the end of the previous paragraph? And he says the answer lies in our nature. Only by living in a polis and participating in politics do we fully realize our nature as human beings. That's a really interesting perspective to me. And if you think about a lot of the anthropology around humans and how we've developed and how we've become larger and larger and larger societies, like there's a wonderful book called Sapiens, which I just loved. I taught that at the Young Center not too long ago, where an anthropologist does a view of human history. And he starts from the 5 hominid species that were co-resident on this planet, and then Homo sapiens sapiens 1, and drove the others out, right? And we absorbed some Neanderthal DNA, and we absorbed a little Denovian DNA, but Homo sapiens won. So he says, like, why? This is an interesting question for anthropologists. Why did we win? And the dominant theory is that something happened in our brains that allowed us to collaborate in larger groups than any of the other species could do. And by virtue of collaborating more effectively in larger groups, we just outperformed them and outcompeted them. Some of them we obviously interbred with because we have little strands of DNA from a couple of those different groups. But basically, we're the only hominid left standing, right? Kind of interesting. So it carries forward the question of what makes us successful and what is the next level, and do we keep like building bigger circles? You know, so we go from families to tribes to nation states to can we ever see ourselves as one united planet? You know, United Federation of Earth. Can we ever get to that place where there's a big enough circle to love everybody? Expanding circles of care and concern. It's an interesting question. So we exist in a polis as a kind of unique feature of humanity. It's a species differentiator. So polis matters, and participation in the group matters. It changes the group and it changes us to be involved in this participation. So he's saying this is not just about making sure I have food and water and shelter. It's bigger than that. It's just an interesting question. I like the question. All right, on page 197, he says, happiness is not a state of mind, but a way of being. This is the author speaking. And then Aristotle says, quote, an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. So he's defining happiness as an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. A totally different perspective than these other two, right? Than libertarianism or utilitarianism, because he's bringing in this sort of concept of soul and something higher and something best. So our highest and our best is being somehow connected through virtue, through virtuous behavior, with our own happiness. So happiness is not stuff. Does this feel true? Like maybe there's a piece of truth in this? Happiness is more than stuff. So Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of need. There are higher level needs, like for beauty and for transcending ourselves. And then on page 200, Aristotle's vision of citizenship is more elevated and strenuous than ours. This is the author speaking. For him, politics is not economics by other means. Its purpose is higher than maximizing utility or providing fair rules for the pursuit of individual interest. It is instead an expression of our nature, an occasion for the unfolding of our human capacities, an essential aspect of the good life. I like that. So there's something in here that's very attractive to me, and I think attractive to Michael Sandel, which is why he's saying we kind of need to bring this back. And this is an ancient theory of social justice. Maybe we bring it back and add it to our modern theories of social justice. Now he talks about wisdom, and I like it. You know, this is the Church of Practical Christianity. And he talks about practical wisdom. And when I talked about spiritual intelligence on the first day, I talked about spiritual intelligence is the ability to behave with love, which means the ability to behave with compassion and wisdom. So we got a kind of little wisdom connection coming in here that I like very much. That it's about how we can act. It recognizes the particular situation because it is practical. And then he says, practical wisdom is a moral virtue with political implications. So this is the author speaking, but summarizing Aristotle's position. But I love that. Practical wisdom is moral virtue with political implications. People with practical wisdom can deliberate well about what is good, not only for themselves, but for their fellow citizens and for human beings in general. So look at those concentric circles. What is good for me? What is good for my society? What is good for humanity in general? Expanding circles of care and concern. Deliberation, I'll just keep reading this paragraph, is not philosophizing because it attends to what is changeable and particular. It is oriented to action in the here and now, but it is more than a calculation. It seeks to identify the highest good attainable under the circumstances. The highest good attainable under the circumstances. And the final bullet here, and I love this because it reminded me of Brene Brown at the end of the bottom of the page. We become good at deliberating only by entering the arena, weighing the alternatives, arguing our case, ruling and being ruled, in short, by being citizens. Passivity doesn't get you there. You must get in the arena. So we have to have a lot of courage because getting into the arena is a courageous act. Engaging in life, engaging in politics is a courageous act. Loving fiercely is a courageous act. I think for those of us who are here at Unity because this is our home church, we are called to love God, love our neighbor, and ourselves. There is no more demanding requirement to try and embody that in our lives. So daring greatly and being willing to get in the arena and being willing to self-interrogate and become the most virtuous self we can be is a call that to me is very resonant with the teachings of Jesus as well as the teachings of Aristotle. Make sense? So what is the purpose of a society? The lower tier is more survival-based, very reminiscent of Maslow. Claire Graves and Maslow knew each other, and they cross-fertilized with their ideas. What commitments are we willing to make to each other? And if you think about a family, it's easier to think about this. So a functional family makes commitments to each other, right? Husband and wife or partner and partner, they make commitments. They make commitments to their children. Are all of those commitments written down in a legal contract? No, a lot of them are just sort of worked out verbally or even non-verbally. There's some assumptions about things, right? Nations have social contracts. They are not all written down. Now, part of ours is written down with the Constitution. All of our American history helps to form our social contract from the Declaration of Independence forward. And all the modifications that we have made, the Bill of Rights, all of the amendments to the Constitution, form modifications to the social contract, but they do not form the whole of the social contract. Make sense? So what is our contract with each other, and do we all have to consent with it? And that's actually a point of argument. Believe it or not, that is a point of argument. What constitutes consent? So let's talk about what makes a non-binding contract is often easy to see. So if you've ever purchased a home or bought a car, you've signed a contract, right? What would make a legal contract of any kind unfair? Just throw out some things that would make it unfair. Signed under duress, coercion, yeah. Lies, misrepresentations, yes.
If the contract is written in a way that the signing can't understand it.
Deliberately being obscure, sort of using elevated knowledge, like a lot of legalese, with someone who can't possibly understand the legalese. And sort of, right. I've also seen credit card agreements printed in like font 6. You know, and I remember hearing a financial company, I don't know whether it's credit card or somebody, bank, lost a lawsuit over their font size because it was not readable to a normal person. It was just too small. So like, there are lots of ways to be unfair, right? Somebody else have ones? Got it, okay. So here's some that I pulled out of the readings. Obviously, if there's no consent, the contract's not binding. So if you faked it, it wasn't really consent. Or if it was consent under coercion, under duress, not binding. If there is uneven bargaining power, often the contract is invalidated by the judicial system because we say, you know, this person was holding all the chips. This person really had no ability to negotiate, so invalidate. The judge might invalidate the contract. Uneven levels of knowledge. Somebody who really doesn't understand what they're giving away and has not been advised by an attorney is sort of maybe, and these things can come together, like was pressured into making a decision without proper information. So you can have all kinds of ways that this could go wrong. No reasonable exchange of benefits. And the example used in the book was a pretty funny one of a widow, I mean, funny, sad, of a widow who agreed to pay like $45,000 to get her toilet repaired. Now, we could say she might not have been right upstairs. She might have had mental impairment. She might have not had any clue what the market price was. There is a visceral elephant gut reaction to shame on that plumber for pulling the wool over her eyes and charging an outrageous and unfair price when her toilet was stopped up. So we had this sort of uneven exchange of benefit argument in the book using the illustration of a $45,000 payment to repair a toilet is an uneven exchange of benefit by any normal person's standard. Plumber, you're in the wrong, give the money back minus $150 or whatever. So, all right, let me back up here. So legal contracts have very specific laws. Social contracts are a slightly different thing. Because a lot of our social contract is an agreement we've made with each other on what's the right way to be a human with each other. And it begins in the smallest unit, the family, and it expands out from there. And one of the general agreements that we make is like, I give you your space, you give me my space. If it's not hurting me, I'm pretty much not going to bother you about it. So that's sort of the libertarian freedom piece that we try in this country to mostly give each other. But a lot of these things have not been written down. The only people who come to explicitly agree to the Constitution are immigrants. First generation immigrants, when they become American citizens, explicitly agree to the Constitution. Did anybody in here who was born here have to sign something that said, I will adhere to the American Constitution? Unless you're in a political office that requires you to swear on the Bible or something that says, I will uphold the Constitution, most of us have not made an explicit consent. So then the question arises, and people can argue over this till their heads explode, and I don't want to go there, about, like, if I haven't explicitly consented, am I bound? And there are arguments on both sides of that, but generally I say, yeah, you're stuck with it. If you're here, you're stuck with that contract. Somewhere way back, your ancestors agreed to it, so you are stuck with it, but you have the right to vote to improve on it. So if you don't like the details of how we're enacting the Constitution, you can have an influence, but you're not king or queen. Like, you're part of a democracy, which has implied limitations. Now, this fellow, John Rawls, has a way of kind of thinking about contracts that's quite different and helpful. I want you to imagine that you were drawing up the social contract for this country, and you were drawing it up, not born yet. And he calls this sitting behind the veil of ignorance. You don't know who you're going to be yet, so you have no vested interest yet. Right? And some of the things you don't know, all you know is you're going to be born on American soil. That's all you know. And it could be a U.S. military base overseas, but it's considered, for this purpose, U.S. soil. You don't know if you're going to be wanted or unwanted by your birth parents. Right? You don't know if you're going to be born into a family that's rich or middle class or poor. You don't know if you're going to be the firstborn child or the 10th child or somewhere in between. You don't know if you're going to be born to a married couple or a single mother. You don't know if you're going to be placed up for adoption, placed in the foster system, or raised by your own parents. You don't know what ethnic or racial group you're going to be in. You could be African American, Native American, Mexican American, Caucasian American, Chinese American, or any of 100 other possible hyphenated Americans. All right? Actually, we're all hyphenated Americans. We're all hyphenated. It's just which hyphen, what goes in front of the hyphen. You're either Native American or some other hyphenated American. Right? And you might even say it's not even Caucasian American, it's some form of European American, German American, French American, Italian American, whatever. You could be born into any religion. You might be born into Islam, Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Scientology, Christianity, Judaism, pick it. You could be born into an atheist family. You could be born into a secularist family. You might be born into a family that is English first language or not. You could be born male or female cisgendered, meaning you identify with your physical form. So I'm born genetically and anatomically female, and I identify as a female. Or you could be born in any of the various gender varieties that we're now realizing are out there. Okay? You could be born heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual or other in terms of who you're sexually attracted to. You could be born with all your limbs or not. You could be born with a high IQ or average or below average. You might be born with a learning disability or not. You could be born healthy or have a whole lot of health issues right from the go, right from the beginning. You might be born and live in a farm town, a coal town, a seasonal beach community, an urban center, which could be poor or rich or other, a suburban neighborhood, or your family might be homeless or any other variety. You could be born in a U.S. state or in a U.S. territory, like Puerto Rico, American Samoa, American Virgin Islands, where you actually don't have full voting rights. You don't know. You could be born in the District of Columbia. The school in your area could be great or awful or middle of the road. Your neighborhood could be safe, or there could be shootings and gangs might be common, and going to and from school could be the scariest part of your day as a child. Your neighborhood could be very homogeneous or very diverse. And there's other things that I keep thinking of that I didn't even put on here, one of which is you could be here legally, or you could be the child of illegal immigrants. And you might be here, and this might be all you know, but you're not legally here. You could be one of the dream children, the DACA protected children. So you don't know any of this. If you don't know any of this, what rules would you establish to govern society? John Rawls is a hugely respected modern philosopher who has taken this whole conversation to the next level. So If you haven't read his chapter, please read his chapter. He believes a socially just arrangement can only exist if we would pick the rules from a position behind the veil of ignorance, which is the exercise you just did. If you don't know who you're going to be before you're born, you can't be arguing for vested interests. So not knowing creates a different emotional space, a different mental space where you can think in a more egalitarian way. And he calls what gets created a hypothetical agreement created in an initial situation of equality. So he believes that our social contract is not a literal contract, it's a hypothetical agreement based on what you could think of as common sense if you put yourself through this exercise with an open heart. So if you put yourself through this exercise, what would you choose? You would not choose discrimination against the person you might be born to be, right? So he believes that number one, we would all choose equal basic liberty for all citizens, and that would be the sort of winning card. No matter what, equal basic rights. This is our highest priority. Secondarily, social and economic governance would be based on something he calls the difference principle. This is complicated. We're not going to get into it. Read about it. But he's basically saying if you're going to tinker with society, if you're going to meddle in the rules, you should only meddle in the rules in a way that is going to help benefit those least advantaged in the society. And he has a set of ways of thinking about this. He's not advocating communism or completely equal distribution of money. He believes in allowing for differentiation based on merit, because merit can accomplish certain things. But it can also get out of whack and get crazy. So it's kind of like, how do we think about it? He's got a very robust, very complex, rich, deep, broad approach. And people study him and make a lifetime out of studying him. But I think it's quite interesting what he's trying to do in terms of bringing these things together. Let me do a little quick polarity mapping to wrap up some stuff from last week and set the stage for next week. In our first week, we talked about polarity mapping. Should you take care of other people or should you take care of yourself? You all remember that one? Yes. And the answer is both, right. And you can get over-focused on either side, and you can get excessive and crazy either way. But for families, we looked at families in both of these cases. Here, the goal, a healthy family, and here, the goal, producing healthy adult children. These things are complex, and we tend to have a preferred side, either the blue boxes or the white boxes. This one that we did last week, the results are typed up and are on the desk in front of you. So it's 2 pages, but this is the summary of it. What is the upside of taking care of being a tough parent? You get strong, responsible, resilient, competent children who have appropriate self-esteem. They don't think they're special all the time just because they showed up. They think they're special when they are competent and they work hard and they earn it, right? What's the upside of being tender and nurturing? We feel seen and loved by others just because we are. We trust that others can be depended on to help us out in times of need, and we develop empathy. So there's an upside to each of these. The goal of healthy parenting is to capture the upside of both. We can easily end up in a situation, however, where 2 parents are just arguing like crazy and ricocheting back and forth, and what you get is the downside of both. You end up, instead of an and, in what's a double down. And in a sense, in our society right now, we're having some double downs. Okay? We're not only not at the end place, but we're rocketing back and forth in such hard swings and from such polarized positions that we're going to get the negative of each instead of the positive of each. So how do you help? How do you become a part of the solution? Well, obviously you have to open your heart to realize your story is only half the story. So let's take this one. Let's say you're the tender, supporting spouse. You're married to or living with, co-parenting with a tough, challenging spouse. All right, the other parent has been doing so much tough that the child is either becoming contracted, intimidated, or becoming a bully themselves, or developing oppositional defiant disorder, or being cowed and broken, any of which can happen from excessive tough, right? Now, you're the tender-hearted person saying, we need to go up here. Now, the tender-hearted person sees the white blocks. It sees This person sees the downside over here and the upside over here. The person who prefers the white pole is a little blind to the two blues. Remember that, right? We're each a little blind and only able to see our own side. If you argue with the parrot who likes tough and says, we need to make sure Johnny feels seen and loved and develops empathy, it's very possible, depends on the relationship, but you might hit a brick wall. And this person might not only say no, but heck no, foul words might be involved. So pushing to go straight here might not work. So what would polarity management inform us about as we think about this mapping as a way to do it? And it looks like this, all right? It's more complicated than we wish it was, but it makes a lot of intuitive sense once I explain it. You say, honey, I love you. And I know we are both committed to having Johnny grow up to be a competent, healthy, thriving adult. North Pole. So you restate your trust and commitment to each other, and you restate the North Pole. And I know that you are personally committed to being sure that Johnny is strong, responsible, resilient, competent, and has just the right amount of self-esteem. I further understand that what you worry about is him becoming a weak, dependent, sniveling little brat. Right? Notice that these are the blue squares. You started at green and you went to your partner's preferred two squares, not yours. Only when you demonstrate deep, heartfelt listening do you have a shot at this working. With deep, heartfelt listening, you then come back to the North Pole. And again, I just want to say I'm with you. I want Johnny to be a strong and healthy adult as well. Having done this, do you think there's potentially some opportunity for Johnny to develop a little more concern for other people? And you have to be careful how you word it, and this is where spiral dynamics can be really helpful. You word it in the language of the listener, but you word it so that you can find some common ground. So what do you know about your partner that you know they do want that could be in this upper box? You want Johnny to feel loved just because he's our child. He was born and we cried because we were so proud. I'm choking myself up. And this is a fictional child. So you find this place where, yeah, okay, I can get that. At no point do you go down here and tell them the negative of their pole. Why would that be? You're going to trigger their elephant to go charging off and not listen to you. You're going to make them mad. The resistance is going to come back. So you say, yeah, can there be a little bit we could do here? Yeah. And we never want to forget what you're trying to accomplish over here because we want Johnny to be healthy. Make sense? It's counterintuitive initially. It's not what we're doing in the political realm, right? We're doing the opposite. We're doing that previous one where it's hell no, hell no, hell no, hell no. And we're getting the double down as a result. Once you really get to this level of conversation, there are 4 more boxes to be completed. So I told you this looks simple when you start, but there's a lot to it. And what you can do is you can start talking about what are some things we can do to help emphasize the tender in Johnny's life. And what are the warning signs that we've been doing too much tender? How will we know we've hung out here too long? Which is speaking to the fear of the tough partner. And how would we know if we've become like too tough for too long? And if we get down here, we've been too tender, what are the steps that we need to toughen Johnny up again? And so it becomes a pragmatic, collective, loving commitment to the North Pole, which in this case is a child, but for the larger course of conversation is healing the heart of America. So where does this all start? Where does this work start?
In the heart.